Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Insidious Environmentalisms, the Art of Greenwashing. Now, this is the first in a series of workshops under the banner Confronting Emergent Dystopia. This is a working group with the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture. But we'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects, things happening all across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream to YouTube as well as Zoom. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, comments or questions are great. Just pop those into the chat and we'll try and get those into the conversation. For those of you here in the space, kind of the same idea. If you have any comments, questions, raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone around so that everyone can hear. Okay. With that, it's very much my pleasure now to hand the microphone over to Assistant Professor, Sustainable and Equitable Economies, the School of Community and Public Affairs, Vijay Kolinjivadi. Vijay, welcome in.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today in the afternoon, and also for our speakers who are arriving from different locations, different places in the world, and at different time zones. So this is actually, as was just mentioned, our first event in the working group entitled Confronting Emergent Dystopia. And our group brings together unique interdisciplinary discussions that seek to unsettle structures of separation, alienation, and to better identify where our kind of unsustainable, in quotation marks, let's say sustainable futures exist and for whom. So dialogue between STEM, the arts and social sciences has been quite meager, despite potential for interdisciplinarity in confronting various challenges. And so in studying and thinking through dystopic conditions, our working group desires another kind of future and asks racialized, indigenous, queer, trans, non-binary students, academics, and community members what else might be possible. So confronting emergent dystopia asks us to think about how we think, create, and sustain futures through intergenerational solidarity building. And when faced with emergent and delusional dystopic, quote, solutions that further reinforce the root causes of problems, what strategies can we as students, academics, and community members enact to envision alternative futures? And so we will host a series of 8 events, 1 per month throughout the academic year. And these events will be co-facilitated by faculty, graduate students, other academics, artists, and members of the community at large. So I will pass this on to Casey.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Hello, everybody. My name is Casey Burkholder, and I'm a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Social Justice and Youth and Child Studies here at Concordia and co-organizer of this event. So our first event of our working group is called Insidious Environmentalisms, the Art of Greenwashing, which aims to bring together different experiences from around the world, including from right here on unceded Indigenous territories where we now stand. We want to remind everyone that the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are the custodians of the land and waters in which we reunite here today in Tiohtià:ke, or Munyang as it's also known. As historian and political ecologist Corey Ross has demonstrated in his book Ecology and Power in the Age of Empire, documenting the environmental impacts of European imperialism and how settler colonizers understood and took advantage of environmental problems to further demonize colonized peoples. From the beginning of the colonial project, settlers have despoiled the land, extracted resources, exploited labor, engaged in violent acts of ethnic cleansing and indigenous erasures, and then attempt to redeem themselves as the green, eco-friendly saviors of their own crimes, while blaming colonized people as the environmental criminals who destroy the land they've lived on for centuries and have no sensibility to care for it. Greenwashing is therefore not a new concept. It's as old as colonialism itself. Greenwashing is often described as a PR strategy, a way for companies and governments to polish their image while selling us products or services. But what we're seeing here today goes far beyond marketing. This isn't just branding, it's a form of collective gaslighting, making us doubt our own intelligence about the crises we're witnessing. It's the deliberate weaponization of terms like sustainability, ecology, and environmentalism to justify actions that lead to genocide, ecocide, and even deeper exploitation of people and the planet. In this sense, it's not just marketing, it's direct physical and psychological violence for both current and future generations. Okay, so think about it. The planting of monocultural forests that kill biodiversity, the militarization of conservation areas that violently displace communities in the name of protection, so-called ecotourism projects that carve airports and luxury malls into fragile ecosystems, solar parks and wind farms built on destroyed habitats, net zero cities rising from the exploited labor of migrant workers, carbon negative yachts for billionaires, even energy efficient ski resorts in the middle of the desert. These aren't contradictions, they are insidious environmentalisms, violent re-engineerings of land, labor, and life itself, dressed up for consumption. And all of it erodes the very ecosystems and conditions that allow life to thrive. So in this session today, we want you to pay particular attention to two questions that can help guide our discussion after we hear from the four speakers. The first is this: when you hear the word ecology, what comes to mind? What does it mean to you personally, and how do you see that meaning getting twisted, co-opted, or distorted by the kinds of so-called green interventions we've been talking about today? The second is, how might we outthink greenwashing before it even starts? And instead of getting surprised or outraged by it, what would it look like to anticipate it and to strip greenwashing of its power to persuade? Could we imagine creative counter-branding strategies that expose the hypocrisy before it lands? We want to encourage you to jot down your ideas throughout the talk, and we'll be responding to these ideas and to the talks themselves through collage at the end of the session, just behind this area here. So please feel free to make a collage that responds to something that resonates with you from the talks, or might even be a way to undo greenwashing. For example, you could speak back to a real greenwash slogan like the notion of the net zero city of the future, and redesign the ad with what it really means to you.
So just before we hear from the speakers, I'll just briefly introduce them. So first, we have Pankaj Sekhsaria. Pankaj is an interdisciplinary researcher and academic working at the intersection of environment, society, technology, and development. He has over 3 decades of working in and around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and has edited and authored 6 books on issues there. His latest edited volume is called The Great Nicobar Betrayal: Pushing a Vulnerable Island Knowingly into Disaster. And he's joining us online from Mumbai. Next, we have Ghada Sasa, who is a Palestinian activist scholar who just obtained a PhD in international relations from McMaster University. Mabruk to Ghada. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on Israeli green colonialism, Palestinian resistance, and means of achieving social and environmental justice. She is a public educator who has published in politics, Middle East critique, and international affairs, and she also joins us online. Next, we have Nicolas Renaud to my left, who is an assistant professor and program director of the First People Studies program in the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia. He is also a filmmaker and artist in contemporary art. His areas of research include Wendat culture and history, indigenous ecologies, and colonialism in Quebec. He is of mixed Quebecois and indigenous heritage and is a member of the Huron-Wendat First Nation of Wendake. And last but not least, we have Starlit Simon, who is Mi'kmaq from Elsipogtog First Nation, and who currently resides in Fredericton, New Brunswick. She is a part-time creative non-fiction writer whose topics range from perspectives on art and culture to social and political concerns. Highway hunting across New Brunswick for porcupine quills to create art is one of Starlit's passions and keeps her connected to the land and to her culture. Starlit has recently defended her PhD proposal and is now a candidate at the Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick. Congrats. So a huge thanks to you all for your time and energy committed to this event. And I'd also like to take this moment to thank the sponsors and endorsers to this event who've helped support with food and drink, which is in the back if anyone's interested, coffee and cake. So that's Concordia Social Justice Center, Academics and Staff for Palestine, the South Asian Diasporic Collective, SADC, and the Joy Lab. So without further ado, let's go straight to the conversation. I will pass this on to Pankaj. And we'll ask if you can maybe keep your questions. We'll have some space at the end after we hear from everyone so that we can we can have that space for the questions, but also for bringing it together. And so I will leave it to you, Pankaj.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks a lot, Vijay, for this invitation and for this opportunity to speak and present what I'm going to present. It's like really almost midnight here, so I'm not sure I'll be able to continue. After the presentation, I'll try and stick on for else. If there are questions that come up, and maybe share them with me, and I'd be happy to respond over email, and you can forward them. If I manage to survive through the next couple of hours, I'll still stick around. And I'm also listening to the introduction and the context. I'm kind of not very sure where to begin in terms of the presentation that I want to make and I've been asked to make. I will, rather than go into the larger issues that have been discussed and kind of place as a context, what I will do largely is to present a kind of empirical case study, one that's kind of unfolding even as we speak, that really answers to, talks to, and even questions and aligns with many of the concerns that were raised in the introductory messages and the notes by both the organizers. So, and given the paucity of time, there's a huge amount of detail there, as you can imagine, but I will try to compress that and keep to this 15 to 20 minutes so that we don't delay too much and you get a sense of something that's kind of very big that's unfolding here in India at this point of time, one among many things. And now I'm just going to try and just give me a moment. I'm there you are. Right. Is the screen visible? Is my slide? Can somebody just confirm that to me, please?
Yes, it is. Yes.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk to you about one little tiny island, and I'll give you the context where, as speak, is one of the biggest and the largest infrastructure projects perhaps ever conceived in India. That's a total value of about $10 billion, which for a country like India is a very, very large amount of money to be spent on one particular island. Like Vijay mentioned, there is a edited volume that we did about a year ago, which was called The Great Nicobar Betrayal. That's the name of the island, and I'll give you a bit of a context. And we called it betrayal for obvious reasons, which is a strong word, and I've had to defend this in multiple platform and fora and ask why it is, and I've repeatedly tried to argue why we've considered this to be a betrayal. So the Great Nicobar Island that you see on the left here is in that sense, a large single island of 900 odd square kilometers, but a drop in the ocean in that sense. And there's a large four component project here that you can see that was first kind of articulated just 3 or 4 years ago through a very massive Government of India program. And this island, these are the four components of the project. There is a massive container transshipment terminal that seeks to get traffic from international cargo liners that are going very close to that place. I'll show that to you. There's an international airport in that component. There is a township and development program and the power plant. And there are multiple problems with each of these. This is an extremely pristine, almost uninhabited island with two small indigenous communities who've been here for thousands of years, know very little about them. Not more than 1,000 people across these two communities. and a very small settler population, which has interesting historical context, which we won't go into. It's a rich biodiversity hotspot. It's in the tropical belt. It's about 6.5 degrees to 7 degrees north latitude. So in the tropical belt, and multiple importances in terms of the biodiversity and the indigenous community and their rights historically and even within the Indian constitutional framework. For instance, this massive township of 130 square kilometers, which is roughly 20% of that island, is a huge amount of landmass. And formal figures suggest in today's times, cutting down of 1 million trees for this project. And scientists say that it could actually be 3 million or 10 million trees. So in today's era of talking of a project that upfront says that, yes, we will cut down so many trees, itself is so problematic. And many other things to be. Here is a geographical context. On the left-hand side, you see the landmass, the main landmass of mainland India. You see the island of Sri Lanka here. I hope this gives you a sense of geography. We have Indonesia here at the bottom right of the map, and very important, the star is the epicenter of the earthquake and tsunami, the Southeast Asian tsunami of 2004, of December 2004. It's exactly 20 years. And an earthquake of 9.3 in the Richter scale, and the damage that was caused, we are all aware of, and we are sitting in that extremely tectonic landscape. So you have Myanmar here, you have Indonesia here, and this is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, known as the Andaman in the north and the Nicobar in the south. And the island that we are talking about is this largish little island here called Great Nicobar that I mentioned, which is the southernmost in this island group, and it's just about 100 nautical miles north of Indonesia. And you have the 5-degree north latitude that passes through here, just to give you a context of the whole thing. Now, what's very important and interesting is this kind of map, where again you see Great Nicobar here, you see Singapore, these are the islands, you have India, and these are the Malacca Straits, which is one of the most important, if not the most important, shipping strait in the world, where a large amount of cargo kind of goes through from the two sides of the world. And this island of Great Nicobar, marked in red over here, sits really literally on top of that Malacca Straits, and that makes it very important from a strategic and from an economic point of view, or that is the argument. And there is a very interesting and a very complex, and in some senses a problematic history of the islands, going down into colonial times with the British, and as one would imagine, many dimensions to that. But if you were to just cut the long story short and come to a moment today when this, like I mentioned, this pristine island of Great Nicobar, which I mean, this is roughly 900 square kilometers of absolutely pristine tropical evergreen rainforest, as you can see in this picture here, home to 2 indigenous communities whose settlements have not even been mapped by the state. They're so remote, they're so inaccessible, at least one community. Rich biodiversity hotspot. And this is what we are actually talking about. I'll give you some examples of the biological richness of this place. These are tree fern forests within the biosphere. This is a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So many aspects of this are very important and to keep in mind. This is the home of indigenous endemic species like this bird known as the Nicobari megapode, which is a ground-dwelling bird that has very interesting breeding behavior. It's unique to the world in the sense that it's found only on a couple of islands in the Nicobar group. It builds a mound of earth as a nest, and it lays its eggs inside that mound of earth. A little bit of a link between, probably an evolutionary link between reptiles like crocodiles and others that lay eggs in the soil, and birds that build nests and incubate their eggs with their body heat. This bird does not incubate its eggs with the body heat, but just an example of the richness of this place. Another very important dimension, and I'll come to this, is the beaches on these islands are nesting sites for 4 of the 7 species of sea turtles that are found in the oceans, including the giant leatherback, which is the largest. And the bay, which I showed you in the map, and I'll come to that a little later, known as a place called Galathea Bay, is the most important nesting site of the giant leatherback in the entire northern Indian Ocean. Uh, these turtles don't nest on the beaches of mainland India. They only nest in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and on the beaches of Sri Lanka in this part of the world. And this particular beach, which where the proposal investment is for $4 or $5 billion, is the most important nesting site of this turtle. This is a very ephemerally beautiful track of the giant leatherback as she comes from the deep oceans onto the beaches, lays her eggs, and then goes back into. And sea turtles are among the most amazing, as some of you will recognize, the most amazing creatures in terms of very little being known about them, the journeys that they undertake, and for the fact that the giant leatherback has been on the planet since the time of the dinosaurs. The issues of concern, as you can imagine, with this project are multifaceted. The ecological, the geological. I mentioned the indigenous people. There are questions of the economic viability of the project, and of course, there are issues of law and due process. And in the interest of time, I'm really going to skip through some of this, and I'm going to request Vijay also to help me keep track of time. And at about 15 or 18 minutes, if you can tell me, then I wrap up. So, or if you can give me a couple more minutes, that also be okay.
Yeah, you still have time.
Yeah, great. So this quickly is where the port is coming up, and if you can see the cursor move, this is about a 2 kilometer beach, absolutely pristine silver sands on which the giant leatherbacks and 3 other species nest. The Bay of the Mouth, the mouth of the bay, today is about 3 kilometers wide, with turtles swimming in and nesting here. With an initial drawing of the port project, the breakwaters and the construction will now restrict the opening of the mouth from 3 kilometers to 300 meters, restricting the entry by 90%. And there are scientific institutions and government institutions in India which have said this will not impact the nesting of the turtle. So there's no doubt about the fact that once this happens, this nesting beach, which turtles have nested for millennia perhaps, and which is the most important, is going to be gone completely. Also, what's very fascinating about sea turtles, particularly the giant leatherback, and then particularly the giant leatherback in that nest on the beaches of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, some satellite tracking studies have shown that after nesting on the beaches in these islands, they are swimming 10 to 12,000 kilometers on either side of the nesting areas. About 12,000 kilometers to the African coast, to Madagascar and others, and about 10,000 kilometers to the Australian coastline. So we're talking of creatures that are really connecting the planet in a way that we have very little information about. This is the only satellite tracking study with 10 turtles that were satellite tagged. So one can only imagine what other things are happening. And this completely is a landscape of the unknown unknowns. We have the known unknowns, and of course then the unknown unknowns, and we seek to lose that, so to say. There have been talk of, for instance, I won't go into the details here, but Galathea Bay, as you can see circled in red, has been identified in Government of India documents as an important marine habitat in India. But at the same time, as this document is being created in 2021, we have this massive project that goes ahead and locates this huge project right in the heart of that particular bay and on nesting site. So there are contradictions, there are hypocrisies, which I just want to point out too. I'll skip this very quickly. That's a large story, and in the context of what was laid out earlier, I think very important. I mentioned these two indigenous communities, and there's them, of course, their language, their rights, the fact that they have constitutional guarantees. And yet, when we talk about the betrayals that I mentioned earlier, for instance, as you can see circled in this text, the Director of Tribal Welfare, which is the legally and constitutionally institution in these islands for the protection of the indigenous communities. Of course, there is a certain nature of the relationship where it is quite patronizing, but even given that, you have the entire island, roughly the entire island, also protected as a tribal reserve under certain local regulations. And that agency that is mandated to protect those lands actually writes in this letter as the project comes up to say that if the project authorities require the lands of the tribal community, we will help in facilitating the denotification and making that land available. And that's actually happened. About 850 square kilometers of the reserve which exist almost 100 square kilometers is to be denotified and to be handed over. There are, I won't go into details here, but this is a quick process, a document showing the quick process of how a very central tribal rights regulation law that came into India in 2006, 2007, how it has been kind of manipulated and violated. For 14 years, the state did not do anything about what is called the settling of the rights of the indigenous people because they thought it was not important. But unless a certain legal process is followed, lands cannot be made available for these kinds of infrastructure projects. So something that was not done for 14 years, between 2007 and 2022, an entire process was then completed in 22 days through various violations of committees and processes in which there was no indigenous or inappropriate indigenous representation and many other aspects of that whole thing. They're seeking to bring in, today the population of this island is 5,000 people or maybe 8,000 people, of which 1,000 people are indigenous. The project entails the bringing in of 300,000 people to this one island. So just the sheer numbers and the impact is going to be phenomenally destructive because 300,000 people coming into that land, this is a kind of a forced colonialism, if you ask, or a forced settler kind of population. Their needs, their demands, their political primacy over the whole thing, the waste generated, infringement into the lands of the people, the destruction of the forest, the cascading effect can only be imagined. And there are deeply problematic articulations in the project proposals when we raised questions. For example, you can see circled and highlighted in yellow is that the state says we will separate the outsider and the insider by putting barbed wire fences so that there is no interaction and there is no impact on the indigenous communities, which is never going to happen. But just the understanding of how these things happen is so poor and so inconsiderate is that absolutely shocking. Also, what is
Pankaj, I wonder if you can maybe wrap it up a little bit and maybe move towards the focus on the on the sort of environmental response to the project.
All right. So just to say that there's also a very deeply seismically active zone where I will. So this is a lighthouse that stands almost at the project site. The lower picture is one that is a pre-tsunami, pre-2004 image. And you can see where the lighthouse stands. And the same lighthouse is now in water because this land saw subsidence of about 15 feet, permanent subsidence. So you're talking of a deeply tectonic activity laden area and huge economic risks that actually are also being taken. And the project proponents don't seem to really worry about all of this. We have this, the environment impact assessment, which is on document. And, coming to what Vijay was saying, that a deeply problematic conditionalities which talk about creating, for instance, there is one condition for environmental clearance which says trees with nesting holes of endemic owls to be identified and geotagged with the help from SACON, is an institution, and such trees shall be safeguarded as far as possible. So there's the performance, the performativity of being concerned about the environment through this environmental clearance process. But something like this, for instance, is completely unimplementable. So we did a back of the envelope calculation. If you have 1 million trees and you want to go about looking for nesting holes of owls in a tree that grows up to about 150 feet in height, it would take about 10 years for a bunch of very accomplished ornithologists to even just tag those trees and study them, leave alone find the endemic owl. So there are many of these conditionalities that are there. Now, this is the other very interesting. So the agencies that gave the permission for the denotification of the sanctuaries and for coming up of the project, wildlife organizations, within the project budgets now there are budgets for conservation plans, which the very institutions are going to get the money when they were the institution that actually cleared these particular projects. So this is an institution called the Wildlife Institute of India, which was a very important agent in giving the permission when they did not have any expertise, or they said they have never done any sea turtles studies in these islands, and they seek to get a huge amount of money now for conservation plans. So you become the perpetrator of the problem, and then you also benefit from that. There have been questions on economics. I won't go into that. Scientists have been worried, saying that they're scared to speak about this whole thing. And I just coming to this one aspect of what you see on the left-hand side are the lands very close to the capital of India called the Aravalli Forest, which is a dry scrub land. On the right-hand side is a picture of the tropical evergreen forest of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And what's happened here is in this whole compensatory afforestation, which has become this deeply problematic issue, is that 130 square kilometers of destruction of this tropical rainforest that you see on the right-hand side is going to be compensated by declaring the double the amount of area 3,000 or 2,000 kilometers away as forest land. So there can be no equivalence of any kind. And this compensatory afforestation business has now been taken to its completely absurd limit. So you destroy a forest far away from a completely different ecozone with human communities, with a different biodiversity. And you say it's okay to kind of take away another 260 square kilometers of land in a completely different landscape. And there are problems in multiple ways, because one is this does not work. This is no equivalence. And the other thing is that we have no idea of what is this 260 square kilometers of land in this area, which is a completely different landscape. So there's ownership, there is use already in these 260 square kilometers. It is not empty land that somebody comes and just takes up. And so you create a kind of, it's a double whammy in that sense. And given some of the problems in governance in a country like India, lands that were notified as forests with all its problems were almost immediately, parts of it were denotified for mining in the same area. So you've destroyed that forest, a unique forest in a tropical belt 2,000 kilometers away, and you justify that with a compensatory afforestation that is a complete sham, that is not compensatory in any kind of way, and it has its own implications and its own violations. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of how the cost-benefit ratio was calculated. So you see this business of what do you account for and how do you account, and actually you argue by saying, for instance, if you look at this, that there are going to be eco-benefits of afforestation in this 260 square kilometers over 50 years. You have a certain value. There is an economic benefit in net present value, and you have some incremental value, etc. And you say that, so this cutting down of 30 square kilometers of forest, and you can see that number here of 130,000, 13,000 hectares, and you actually come up with a cost-benefit ratio, actually benefit-cost ratio of almost 10:1. So what have you accounted for? And you've actually said that there are benefits to afforestation and bringing that degraded land under forest. So how the numbers are being made to work are so problematic, as you can see. This is from an article that was done recently by very senior scientists, and they speak about the serious problems of this. So this orbit for Patay Takuru, which is on the left-hand side, is the traditional name for the island by the indigenous people. And they are talking about now the need to write an obituary because of this, and they question the idea of compensation, both in terms of rainforest compensation, but also coral reef restoration. So one is what I just described in terms of the rainforest, and then there are 16,000 colonies of coral in the area where the port is going to come up. So the idea, of course, is to just cut that coral and go and place it somewhere close by. And there are serious problems in terms of the cost of that relocation, the economic viability, the ecological relevance of that, and it just does not seem to work. But this idea that ecosystems that have lived there and been there for thousands of years can simply be relocated or can be compensated is at the heart of how this project is being justified, along with the fact that there's going to be a huge amount of economic and strategic benefit. So while one is arguing and the proponents say we have these benefits, there will be losses, but don't worry, these losses can be compensated in these kinds of ways. And this becomes a narrative that is both bureaucratic but also scientific. And then it becomes very difficult because numbers like 10:1 benefit in which we're accounting for afforestation, we're accounting for economic benefits and stuff like that. So that's just a snapshot of how this massive project, one of the biggest in the country ever, with the destruction of the largest single patch of land, forest land in this country, is being justified on multiple grounds, and how what is going to be lost is sought to be compensated in ways that are ecologically flawed, which are economically flawed, and of course, issues of justice. That's not even in the question. So one of the things we did, and I'm going to finish here in just a couple of minutes, is a very detailed documentation in this timeline that you see here, and you have this QR code. And I realize this is one of the biggest contributions we made as researchers is to create a very detailed account of what is happening. So over 4 years, we've been documenting the project on a daily basis, and we have a timeline of about 250 dates where every single happening or development in the project is then mapped, and it's hyperlinked into a Google Drive with the relevant documents. So it's become a very, very important resource. And there are other resources we are trying to do. This is the book that Vijay mentioned. We are just doing another book that's more newer writing called Island on Edge, which should be coming out in about in a month's time. It's in press at the moment. We've tried to do language editions. India is a country of multiple languages and people all over the country. For them to know, we've tried multiple local languages of versions of the book so that we reach out. I don't know if you're going to succeed because we have to keep trying. But yeah, that's it. And there's other stuff I've done on the island, and I'll stop here. That's my email ID. I'm going to stick around for a bit, but if anybody wants to get in touch with me for more information or comments or suggestions, then I'd be very happy to hear from you. And thank you very much. I hope I've not taken too much time, but thanks again for this opportunity, and good day.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. So without further ado, we'll actually move right away to Ghada. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Vijay, and the rest of the working group for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to join you all and be here for the launch. I think it's such an important, obviously, a bit biased, but topic and time to be discussing it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I'm going to try to keep my presentation really brief today. But basically, I'm going to speak about a bit my doctoral project, which I just completed. So I completed my master's in environmental studies, and originally I was going to look at greening Canadian workplaces because as much as I was invested at the time at the liberation of my community, I'm from Palestine, I was at the time thinking like climate change is the more urgent thing that we need to deal with because we're all doomed. And this is very flawed thinking, as I later came to realize that we have to choose between climate change and human rights. But basically, I'm actually going to share my screen, if that's okay. I think I'm going to show here my PowerPoint. Can you see that?
We can see it.
Okay, perfect. So here we go. So I was going to talk a little bit about how basically when I was at York University, I was bombarded by this Israeli greenwashing propaganda, telling us how Israel was making the desert bloom, which is very Orientalist, this idea that like all of the Middle East is just this giant desert and that, the indigenous people don't know how to take care of it, or they were even desertifying it, and that they were, as European ecological saviors, able to redeem the land. And I knew that this was false propaganda because I visited Palestine firsthand, and I've seen how Israeli settlers will burn our olive trees while the Israeli army is there to protect them. And obviously we can talk about so much. For example, Israel has been like diverting water from the Dead Sea and the Jordan River, like drying up these waters while using them to irrigate their European pines, which they have been planting across the country. And so I decided to push back against greenwashing, but in policies in order to cause. And, I was one of the people who popularized this concept. So when it came to do my PhD in political science, I decided to focus on green colonialism. And yeah, I was exploring the socio-ecological consequences of Great Palestine and create a world that protects both human and non-human rights. For example, I was looking at how Israel uses national parks and nature reserves, opening them saying that people, especially Palestinians, cannot live there, while turning a blind eye to Israeli settlers who not only live there, but pollute. And I'm going to show you this map that shows how when Israel created a lot of these parks, they concentrated them in Jerusalem, trying to claim that as its capital in the north of historic Palestine, where most Palestinians who survived the Nakba still remain, and in the south, where they've been targeting Bedouin Palestinians, while the central area around, so-called Tel Aviv, which are almost exclusively settled by Jewish people, they haven't been establishing protected areas. And you can see on the right how in 2018, Israel amended its law in order to allow only Jewish settlers to live in certain national parks. So it was overtly discriminatory. At the same time, I was explaining how Israeli settler colonialism is inherently genocidal and ecocidal because it's about staking a permanent claim to the land. And so they did this through not only erasing our history, culture, dispossessing us, but then at the same time, they have been destroying a lot of the indigenous flora and trying to Europeanize the land. That's why they brought a lot of trees from Spain, also eucalyptus trees from Australia, in order to assert their right to the land. And then here I talk about how in 1969, Israel basically afforested the Green Line, which separates the West Bank from the rest of historic Palestine. Because in 1967, Israel illegally occupied the West Bank and they were trying to prevent Palestinians there from being able to access the rest of their homeland. So they used trees often to deny Palestinians the right to return. And I want to just say that I was contextualizing what Israel was doing as Western environmentalism, which is an ideology that was founded in the 18th century, mainly by France. And it was this idea that nature and human rights are separate because they were colonizing the land and wrecking the environment, threatening even resources that they prized. And so what they were trying to do by establishing forest reserves was securing timber and saying that now indigenous people need to leave. So in the name of colonization, they were justifying land grab, and then by that, they were securing their economic interests. So I'm going to go back for a second here. And yeah, this talks a little bit more about my theory, and you can see how state delegated protected areas, including national parks, were founded by the US in the 19th century, which also erased indigenous memory because they would rebrand these areas as so-called wilderness. They would use them to build a national settler identity, promote tourism, and then use them as markers of civilization. Whereas the global South, they didn't have this human nature separation. They were deemed as savages. And then the first African national park was introduced by Belgium to Congo. And former English slave owner and plantation manager Charles Waterton invented bird sanctuaries and nature reserves. I was really shocked again learning about this history because these are a lot of noble, these sound like noble environmental policies, but I never learned about their colonial origins in a so-called progressive institution. And then when we studied about colonialism, often the environment is completely neglected as a topic. These are photos of USA Independence Park, which Israel established over 8 Palestinian villages it destroyed. So basically 44% of 418 Palestinian villages that were ethnically cleansed by Israel since 1948 are now considered to be protected areas by Israel. It often directly planted over ruins of the villages that it destroyed in order to erase their memory, Europeanize, and Judaize them. And in these parks, often you'll see the pamphlets, a lot of times they're only written in Hebrew, and they'll purposely only refer to Roman history and just completely neglect the fact that Palestinians live there and obviously conceal Israeli war crimes. So often Israel planted pine trees because they grew quickly, they were evergreen, so they're there, they're concealing the crimes year round. And then I talked a little bit about Israeli hiking. So how Israel, from before it was founded, actually, Zionists would often march, and they were disguised as harmless backpackers in order to scope the land, raid Palestinian villages, train, build, camaraderie. And they marked the first hiking trail in the Middle East in 1947. So a lot of these trails were already paved by Palestinians because we would use them to travel. But what they did was use them obviously to train, but then also to familiarize themselves with the land and assert ownership over it. And it's actually hiking played a big role in allowing them to colonize the southern half of Palestine on Naqab. And then they concentrate a lot on the border areas. I also explained how in these photos you can see like the West Bank on the eastern side is a lot of the nature reserves and parks that Israel built. And then on the map on the right, you'll see how that same area overlaps with a lot of military zones. So often Israel would plant trees, and it planted 250 million trees since its inception, which the vast majority are non-indigenous to the land. And of course, they're wrecking environmental destruction. A lot of these pines, they produce needles that are, when they fall, they destroy the land. And so even if Palestinians manage to return, if they manage to recognize their homes and villages from these trees, it's hard for them to reestablish any kind of life because it's hard to subsist off the land. And obviously these are not fruit-bearing trees. So yeah, but they used a lot of these trees in order to hide their military operations. Part of my project was an anti-colonial archive. So I looked at what are the memories of these villages that Israel covered up. So I focused, for example, on USA Independence Park, which hasn't really been explored. And what are the original families that lived there, the Arabic names of the waters and their significance, but also the indigenous flora like qaniya at the bottom right, which is a plant they used to make tea to alleviate pain, especially for children. And then I discussed indigenous resistance, both human and non-human forms. We can see until now how the pine trees haven't adapted to the land, despite Israel planting them for decades. Until now, they're burning up like crazy. They die easily due to disease. And then at the same time, the olive trees have remained intact, despite Israel uprooting hundreds of thousands of them. At the bottom, you can see an indigenous person, Palestinian from Bethlehem, who's around the clock protecting the oldest olive tree. And yeah, of course, Palestinians continue to resist through armed resistance, cultural resistance, educational and other means. And then I talk a lot about holistic decolonization. So how I believe that the way forward is we abolish all three large systems of oppression, which are white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And that's how we deal with both human and environmental injustices. And I draw a lot on Palestinian ethics and practices, such as the concept of fauna, solidarity, sumud, steadfastness, but even the idea of sadhas. Instead of this hiking on this specific trail that divides us from the land, it's very much like organic. And, we'll have like picnics on our land. And yeah, there's no this like rigid separation where we have to be quiet on hikes, etc. And then I draw a lot about on Islam. So this idea of tawheed, you can see this picture at the top left. It's about this idea of like God is in the middle and everything else revolves around them. So we don't really have like human or non-human figures in Islamic art. It's very much about like the inner realities and how we're all united as a divine creation. I also talk about the concept of halal, which a lot of people understand as only merciful slaughter, but actually refers to like humane raising of non-humans and understanding their respect, but also their agency rather than being altruistic environmentalists. So my theory and methods, I draw on activism scholarship. So I say that, my desire to change the world for the better is what drives my scholarship. It's at the crossroads of anti-colonialism and environmentalism. And my work is interdisciplinary, global, critical, and holistic. Yeah, I think I'm going to keep my presentation there, but thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Ghada. Thank you so much. And now we will turn it to Nicolas, who will talk to us a little bit about what's happening here in Quebec.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Just a preliminary note, I was thinking about the title of this talk, Insidious Environmentalism, and how I always have an issue with the word environmentalism itself. And just sharing this, this questions that was turning in my head that the word environmentalism is in itself insidious environmentalism. And if we take it from an indigenous perspective, if you live on the land, you care about the land. If you are simply rooted in your culture and being who you are in the network of life around you, you're not an environmentalist. You're just a human being living, one of the creatures on the land. So just to have the category environmentalists, just like today, people say, oh, an activist, it's like something connoted, like good or bad, but it's a category of people. So the category of environmentalism is a very odd one, and it can only come from a civilization, a culture, a moment in time where societies, people are disconnected from the environment. Otherwise, there's no need for such a term. So this was the prologue. I will start by just showing about 3-4 minutes excerpt of a film I made 2 years ago, co-directed with friend and artist Brian Virostek. It is a 36-minute collage of archival promotional films for outdoor tourism in Canada. Those films were produced between the 1920s and 1970s. They were sponsored by various government agencies and the Canadian Pacific Railway, mostly. And the film is a diptych where there's no comment, but as a diptych, we started making the archive speak by themselves, the way that things echo each other, repeat, and national colonial capitalist narrative that is underlying the enjoyment and protection of nature for this new thing that was booming mid-20th century, which was going on vacation, on holidays and camping and enjoying the outdoors. So how the archive kind of has the trace of that psyche, and that the archive still speaks of today, which is national identity, is based both in Quebec and Canada. It's based both on having spaces of wilderness and having a connection to the land and mastering that land, being a modern society that controls nature. So I'm going to show just the beginning. The film is divided in 3 chapters. I'm going to show just the beginning of chapter 3.
The drive from the bus terminal passes the park administration building and the museum, both rustic in design and in harmony with the natural surroundings. The museum contains Indian relics and mounted specimens of wildlife, and has an English garden at the rear.
Is it maybe not going through on Zoom?
On the surface, Jasper is like many other Canadian towns, with its stores and banks, its churches, homes, and schools. Actually, it is unique. A railway town, a western town, a tourist town, and control center of Jasper National Park. A handful of rangers, a few mounted police, a small staff of experts manage this 2.5 million acre heritage of the Canadian people. Men of 100 jobs, they enforce game laws, for Jasper is one of the great game preserves of the continent. They fight forest fires, they maintain roads and trails. They cover the entire terrain from valley floor to mountaintop. So Jasper retains the natural charm and beauty of a mountain wilderness. But it is a wilderness under order and control.
A fenced-in area of 2,000 acres near Lake Audie is the home of a herd of North American bison. These buffalo were once as plentiful as sparrows, but the size of their heads didn't save them from near extinction. The National Parks of Canada did that. For obvious reasons, dogs are not welcome in the park. In addition to community concerts and sing-songs, there are many other attractions in the park. Today, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been persuaded to show the results of their animal training courses. This German Shepherd has a nose for detecting hidden articles purely by their scent.
If it weren't for the work of the park's administration, the accessible waters of Jasper might have been fished out long ago. But millions of fingerlings have come from the park hatchery to stock the 22 lakes within a few miles of Jasper town. There are a lot of potential thrills for anglers in a setting of
All right,
low
we can
growth.
stop it now.
In
Thank
no
you.
time at all, the egg...
All right, so we see that the way they present, advertise the concept of conservation and park is conditional to either two things, like the destruction already happened. So like for the buffalo, you know, and then they take credit for it. So conservation for white Western culture as this psychological moral element where it fills you with a sense of virtue. You've preserved something, you know. And interesting that there's no mention of why did the bison vanish, you know. So they praise themselves for saving it, and they say that the bison themselves, despite having a big head, they're not smart enough to save themselves. So they needed the white man, and no mention of indigenous people. The other condition for the idea of conservation to arise in Western society is that it allows everything else to be free game. We protect this area, so everything else is up for exploitation and destruction. That's the mindset at the root of conservation in national parks in North America. And of course, national parks right away excluded indigenous people. Not just because it's for the enjoyment of paying non-native customers, but there's always that idea that indigenous people are, you know, that being connected to the land is a kind of folkloric myth. In reality, what people think is that indigenous people are savages who cannot protect the land. They'll hunt out of control. They will destroy everything. And this idea remains today. Go anywhere in Quebec where there's less moose, less caribou, less salmon. Ask people around in the towns, why is that? Oh, natives. They overfish, they overhunt, they have no limit, they raid things, you know, all the time. Yet, there's no, as far as I know, there is no clear known collapse of wildlife species due to human activity prior to colonization. They are natural cycles. But I'm not aware of complete depletion of wildlife population by indigenous hunting or fishing prior to colonization. Of course, people say that while indigenous people in Quebec are less than 1% of the population, but somehow they would be responsible for 100% of wildlife. decline. So this was often said, quoted at the beginning of the creation of national parks in Canada, late 19th century, early 20th century. Government officials, conservationists, naturalists, people who love nature would say, well, we got to make sure that natives don't get into the park because they're going to destroy everything, And yet we have this example of the buffalo exactly who end up as a few survivors in a fence, not because of indigenous people. What animal is inside a fence today in Quebec? The caribou. The few survivors of the woodland caribou in Gaspésie, Charlevoix, and Abitibi, those 3 herds, there's 4 or 5 herds that are threatened. The few survivors that number between 12 and 30 individuals, they're now behind fences. That's the Quebec government only response to the decline of the woodland caribou population that scientists have alarmed about since the 80s. And why is that the only response? Because the main cause is the loss of habitat because of overlogging. And the Quebec government will not put any restraint on the logging industry. So they want to keep logging the woodland caribou habitat while saying, well, look, we're doing something. So now they're inside a fence with a collar, and they're fed like that. And there's a mayor of the MRC Haute-Gaspésie in Quebec who even proposed that instead of limiting logging or other activities, since those caribous are starting to be accustomed to people, it would be great for the Gaspé Peninsula to have a zoo of caribou, and that they could hire some Mi'kmaq as shepherd of the caribou, and that they could have greenhouse to grow lichen, not realizing that it takes between 80 and 100 years to grow the lichen that the caribou eats. So that's one of the green projects connected to the caribou and to forestry in eastern Quebec. A few years back, when there was more pressure from the federal government to force Quebec under the law of endangered species to do something about the woodland caribou habitat, then Minister of Forest Pierre Dufour said, forestry is not the cause of the woodland caribou decline. We know that some Innu on Côte-Nord still hunt caribou. So the old colonial mentality that it has to be the indigenous people's fault. Yet the Innu have lived in coexistence and harmony and reciprocity with the caribou for thousands of years. But suddenly, while 70 to 90% of the habitat of the woodland caribou has been destroyed by the logging industry, we should believe that it's the fault of a few Innu hunters who keep hunting for the connection to the land and to the tradition. And Minister Dufour did not mention that communities like Pessamit have voluntarily halted hunting for over 15 years until the herd might recover one day. So this brings us to the current forestry plan that is proposed by the Quebec government. So you might have heard about the resistance, the opposition, both in non-Indigenous society in Quebec and First Nation communities, opposition to Bill 97. I did a talk in July here about it, so if you want more information, it's on Fourth Space channel about Bill 97. One thing that is really difficult to accept for people opposed to it, scientists, Quebecois hunter, fishermen with a cabin in the woods, and First Nation communities, is that Bill 97 would divide the lands into 3 categories. Priority exploitation, multi-use zone, conservation zone. Right now, there's no such division of the land in the current forestry plan, but everyone agrees that the forest is overexploited. We see it on the land, we see the changes, we see the loss of wildlife habitat, we see the effect on the water, we see the effect on warming, we see that the forest that regrows is not the same, or the one that they plant is not the same. So priority management, that they call it, means priority exploitation, will be closed to people. It's exclusively for the industry. They can do whatever they want with 10 years licenses. Okay. Multi-use zone is the industry can still do whatever they want. It's the current situation, but you can go camping and fishing. If you want, it won't be close to you. It's not sure what First Nation community members can do in the priority zone, because it says in the bill that no activity can interfere with the priority of industrial activity, right? But there's a little parenthesis about ritual and social and domestic activities, and no one is sure what that means. Does that mean that you can go like smudge by the lake, but you cannot build a cabin? That's not clear. And then the conservation zone, the third zone, and the government has said that these would be equal. It would be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So the conservation zone will not be open to logging. So we see how this idea of conservation is used to allow an increase in timber production in Quebec to keep overlogging, 2/3 of it. Because it sounds kind of good. You say, oh, 1/3 of the forest in Quebec will be conservation, will be protected. That's huge. The thing is, there's not 1/3 of natural forest left in Quebec, if you know, like the logging of the last 100 years. There's no ecosystemic study of what is the effect of destroying the 2/3 around that 1/3. What is the effect on the watershed? What is the effect on animal migration and feeding and everything, on temperature, because the clear cutting like heats up the ground a lot. So this idea of conservation is used to prioritize industrial interest. Again, also, there is this colonial capitalist mentality towards the land that you divide, you make categories, and you make hierarchies. This is incompatible with indigenous worldview in which we have to build and renew a balanced relationship with the entirety of the land, even when we use resources, even when we have to cut trees, when we have to kill animals, when we pick plants and all of that. It's an overall balanced relationship. But this connects back to the notion of national parks. It means, oh, we'll have a close connection with nature here. Everywhere outside of it, it's open for destroying and taking and profiting, So it's not the idea of having a different relationship with the entirety of the land and non-human life. It's really about making categories. So this idea of the 3 zones in Bill 97 connects back to that. Then, as the minister has said, they will garden the forests. They don't like the idea that forest as a natural entity, is left alone to do its thing. So they use the argument of resilience to climate change to say that it's changing too fast. The forest cannot adapt, even though they have no study that tells them the forest cannot do its work on its own. But so they need to re-engineer it to plant different trees. So it serves the idea to cut more, to replant more. More work, more money for the industry. So even though climate scientists and forest scientists, over 40 of them in Quebec have signed a letter to say that was not our recommendation in drafting the bill. We said that, yes, some management to support resilience is good, but allied with keeping as much natural forest as possible. So it does its own work in its own cycle to adapt to climate change. But the government dismisses that and pretty much wants to transform what's left of Quebec's forest into a vast plantation, So this idea of helping the forest help us against climate change is actually used to further serve the interest of global capitalism and their raid of resources, which demand to pull back environmental regulations and to dismiss indigenous knowledge about the land. And this is what is happening everywhere. When I say pull back environmental regulation, it is concrete in the bill. Article 17.6. A few laws in Quebec will no longer apply in the priority management zone, the law on natural heritage sites, the law on wildlife habitat conservation, and the law on threatened species. Those laws cannot be invoked to halt, to pause logging where a license has already been given. Once that license is given for 10 years in the priority zone, it's explicit in the bill. Those three laws, those three environmental laws no longer apply. And it's the same thing that Carney's doing with C5. It's the same thing that they're doing in Nova Scotia with other laws. It's the same thing they're doing in Ontario with Bill 5. It's the same thing they're doing in France with La Loi du Plomb on pesticides. They reversed it so pesticide companies can go back and sell to French farmers based on false data. So it's happening all over the world, this push to regulate and allow more capitalist industrial activity. So no one is saying that we cannot have logging in Quebec. We need logging. We don't want constructions to be made of plastic and concrete. That's not better for the climate. The issue is how much is left of an ecosystem that supports life. And that should be the limit of how much logging is allowed. So the government has done a lot of public campaigns. If you're Francophone, you've seen the ads, pas de bois, pas grand-chose, no wood, not much, that don't serve to inform the population about anything about the forest. They're simply made to paint a positive picture of the forestry industry in Quebec. And they insist on the terms renewable and sustainable. They say this is a resource that is renewable and the industrial activity is sustainable. So they consider the forest to be only a resource. Of course, the resource is renewable. Trees grow back. Is it ecological the way it is exploited? Can it support biodiversity and ecosystems that harbor life and generate life? That's very different. If you see the forest as a resource only, yes, it is renewable. If you see it as an ecosystem that supports life, the current industrial activity and the projected one that will be 4 or 5 times worse with Bill 97 is not ecological then. And the caribou is not renewable once it is gone. And then they say it is managed responsibly. How can you have public ad campaigns that, by the way, are sponsored jointly by the Quebec government and the coalition of the forest industry in Quebec? You know, your tax money is going into promoting private interest in forestry business. How can you say it is managed responsibly when since the 80s, you have these stacks of studies about the woodland caribou saying they are vanishing because of the loss of habitat? So you have an emblematic species disappearing from the forest because it has no more habitat, and you run ad campaigns saying that our forests are managed responsibly, you know? And this is not naive or innocent. This is a plan, PR campaign behind all that. So I think I'm pretty much made the time. I have a few more notes, but I think I could stop here and we'll see later what we can. Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, and our final speaker is Starlit. So we'll go back online.
Hi. Okay, I'm gonna try to share my, just one sec. I think I can go. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes, we can.
And you can hear me fine? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Starlit Simon, Deloise Starlit Simon, and I'm from Elsipogtog First Nation, from which is part of Mi'kma'ki, the land of the Mi'kmaq, and is one of the 5 nations that make up the Wabanaki Confederacy, which before colonial divisions of land was a political collective of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki that existed in the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, and the American states of Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. I was asked to take part in this talk to sort of counterbrand all that we've been discussing on insidious environmentalism and talk about my research on roadkill epistemology. So my research also includes moving towards how we once were, Don DeLoltiagib, in a contemporary world. So when I first started my research, I had only started harvesting roadkill on a regular basis for a couple of years. But at this point now, I think I've harvested close to 50 porcupines. And when I started doing this, I didn't necessarily think I was partaking in any form of environmentalism. I was just trying to connect with my culture, my history, my ancestral blood memory, and also trying to reconcile my existential issues around death, because my family and my community and my people experience death in such disproportionate and tragic ways. Roadkill porcupine for me took on a form of literal and figurative representation of the harmful impacts of colonialism, capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution, which is often seen as this period of like prosperity. Though really for me, I feel like it's just a surface level of prosperity and actually encourages this unsatiated desire for more and more and more. And it doesn't really give this deep-rooted, rich prosperity that I feel like I get from being on the land, building a relationship with the land, building a relationship with community, and you know, activating all parts of myself as I do this work. So in this image here, I'm showing on the left, I'm showing some of my Wabanaki friends how to harvest porcupines. As you see, we're on the side of the road, and in the picture on the right, I'm on the side of the road. A friend of mine saw me, pulled over, shared some stories with me, and then took this photo. So it tends to be very relational. Oftentimes, harvesting roadkill, people often stop, pull over, ask what I'm doing, and a lot of stories emerge from it, and it's become this really beautiful experience for me. And so naturally, it's just become so much a part of my research, to the point that I've sort of like I've developed this roadkill epistemology where I'm learning so much as I harvest these porcupines and partake in this like traditional art form. So roadkill porcupines help me to understand in a deeper way how my ancestors learned and communicated with the land, how they learned from and communicated with the land. Harvesting porcupine roadkill was method toward forging a connection to my ancestral blood memory and to how we once were, but in a contemporary world. The more I took to the streets to find roadkill porcupines, the more I learned. The lessons and stories from the land and from roadkill porcupine harvesting were abundant, so much so that they will become a bulk of my dissertation. We are extensions of the land, and we all go back to the land. And the land is how we traditionally attain knowledge and knowing. And so when I'm harvesting porcupine roadkill, I feel like I'm connecting with my ancestors and the way that they learned to understand what the land was telling them, how they learned to survive on these lands for time immemorial in these harsh conditions. And oh, sorry. When I think about this term Nedogolimk in my language, in Mi'kmaq language, it's a way of being as Mi'kmaq people, and the word is being used more and more frequently in academia around conservation, environmentalism. And Nedogolimk is described as having a respectful relationship with nature for its present and future abundance, and that the natural world is a sacred gift from Creator. So, roadkill epistemology takes these cultural values and lessons and connects them to reciprocity with the land. By recycling the porcupine quills for artwork that I create to fundraise for various causes, or that express a unique aspect of Mi'kmaq and Wabanaki culture, I make use of this gift from Creator and find ways to give back or tell a story that needs to be told. There is a reduction for the need to kill, hunt, trap porcupines by simply keeping our eyes open for them as we drive. And in harvesting of red willow tobacco that I then offer back to the land in thanksgiving for the life that ended in this porcupine and that I'm in ceremony with. I am practicing reusing nature's materials in a good way. Roadkill harvesting, highway hunting is a form of environmentalism that makes do with what is available to us to keep our traditions and customs and art forms and knowledge systems alive. It allows us to think through our traditional ways of how we once were and how we learn from the land. Through the activation of the whole self. When harvesting from the land, you begin by activating the physical self. After some time, you physically exhaust yourself into a meditative state, soothing the mental self. This physical exhaustion and meditative mind state provides a safe space for the emotional self to emerge, to confront things that were maybe deeply hidden or perhaps bubbling just under the surface, but that the world we live in rarely makes room for in a safe and reflective way. This is just a quick little video of me harvesting a porcupine. I don't know if you can hear the sound. I don't know if I pressed the button I was supposed to press to share the sound, but this one here is a really bushy porcupine. So this is just like a little graph that I made that kind of expresses sort of like this activation of the self that occurs when I'm harvesting porcupines. So it's with this physical exhaustion, this mental meditation and emotional safety that gives way for this spiritual awareness and understanding, and how and why I believe my people, the Mi'kmaq and the Wabanaki, were able to survive for so long on these lands despite these harsh climate conditions. We had our whole selves connected to the land. We had all parts of ourself being activated because we were harvesting and connecting to the land on a regular basis. And we had that relationship with the land, and we had a reciprocal relationship to the land where we were giving gratitude, and making offerings back to the land, um, as thanks for all that creator and all that the land provides us. And it was just this daily recognition that, we are extensions of the land and we go back to the land. We were in good relation with her. We were wasting nothing and treating it and its creatures with respect and reverence. If we slow down enough and be in good relation with her, pick medicines, offer them back to her as a form of gratitude for all she provides us, it keeps that relationship strong, and the lessons she has to teach us are abundant. Environmentalism can develop and manifest just by living the tenets of traditional and ancestral teachings of the value and importance of reciprocity and relationality with the land. And sorry, yeah, here. Recently, in discussion with my mom, we were talking about the Mi'kmaq word for porcupine, which is mudwes. And I had read before that porcupine for Mi'kmaq were, for the most part, left alone. We didn't eat them very much, and we only trapped them for food during harsh times when maybe larger animals were scarce. So they were like a scarcity food. We for the most part left them alone because we only trapped them when food was scarce. Um, when we talked about the word Mudwes, I couldn't help but wonder, like, I wonder why we called Mudwes, because the root word of Mudwes is Madu, which means cheap or subpar. But I didn't feel like that translation really did justice to the word Madu. It's just the closest English translation for it. But it really doesn't have when I translate it into English, it doesn't have the essence of what Madhu could really encompasses. Um, and I was describing this to my mom, and I said, like sometimes you do just have to do your best. And sometimes the end result isn't what you hoped it would be, but it's something and you got it done. Um, and it's good enough. It's not what you hoped it would be, but it was good enough given the conditions, given the circumstances and the time frame. But as we sat there, I thought, like, how does this relate to porcupine? If the root word to Madhues is Madhu, which is sort of this good enough understanding of it in the English language. My mom kind of picked it up pretty quickly, and she said, "Well, you said that we ate the Madhues only in times of scarcity, and so Madhues was what we ate to make do when times were tough. Madhues is symbolic of what we've had to do despite it all, despite all of the circumstances, all of the colonial injustice on Indigenous people and all that we kind of carry and deal with. And sometimes we do just have to make do. And so to me, it was really a monumental moment for me when I realized that that's probably why we called Madhues, because it's make do food. It's what we eat when times are tough. And for me, it's very interesting that I would connect so much with Madhues throughout my life as I grapple with all of the impacts on my community, on my people, on my family from just generations and intergenerational colonial harm. So given the circumstances, it's good enough. And so that made a lot of sense to me, that madawis, meaning porcupine in my language, was the scarcity food, the food we ate to get by. It was what we trapped to make do during times of scarce food. Then we made art with what we couldn't eat of the porcupine. Now in this contemporary world, we are still making do with madawis and picking up what we can from their rundown bodies off the streets. We are making do with keeping our culture, our language, and our customs alive, despite the colonial impacts on Indigenous lives. We are picking up porcupine roadkill off the side of the road and recognizing that while we can't eat them, we can make do with what's available and harvest their quills, make art, and I suppose in the grand scheme of colonial destruction, for now, that's good enough. So that's the end.
Thank you so much, Starlit, and thank you all for your presentations. And yeah, a lot of food for thought, a lot of reflections from these talks. And so I want to maybe, because we want to also have some time to do some collaging as well, to think about counterbranding, but to remember the two questions that Casey had also asked from the beginning, if you had them in mind, of what ecology means, what does it mean, yeah, what does that term really mean, and also thinking about, yeah, this kind of letting greenwash fall flat, and thinking exactly what Starlit has just presented to us, this making do with, you know, what we can do with what we have, and building relationships with the land and with each other. So I want to open the floor first for folks who may have thoughts, reflections. Yeah.
I always have a question. I would love to start. So one of the things that I noticed across the presentations was like fencing and containment and management. And I was wondering if anyone of any of the speakers who are still around, if they were interested in thinking through how the different kinds of projects and strategies use fencing and containment, and then maybe how folks make do or do something different given those containment kind of strategies and structures.
I can just give a general response to that. I mean, the first obvious thing is that it's about taking what's in the way of capitalism and putting it aside without bearing the guilt of exterminating it completely. That's the basic thing at first. So indigenous people were in the way of capitalism on the land. Buffalo and caribou are in the way of capitalism on the land, so they're contained into reserves or into fences. That's one thing. Symbolically, we can say a conservation area is kind of a fence, even though it's not inside a fence. So we do have to acknowledge the paradox in that, that the fence does allow to preserve something, that it's not entirely exterminated. I mean, my own community of Wendake may not exist as a community if it wasn't made into a reserve after they were all converted and moved from Georgian Bay to the Quebec City region. In some communities, the language might have vanished if it was not for that kind of containment. It's not the chosen way to resist assimilation into the core society of Canadian or Quebec state. It's not the chosen way to stay together, but it has that paradox in it. It's the same thing for protected area. You know, there's one protected area in Montreal. It's the mountain. You cannot build a house there or a factory. you know. It's the same logic again, that once that would be preserved, everything else around is free game, you know. But we're happy it is preserved. When we go to Parc Mont-Tremblant, we're happy there is a forest left that's not fully logged, like everything around. So that paradox exists in the containment, but it is dictated by capitalist forces.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that, just as we saw with Pankaj's talk, he's not here, I think, now, but the barbed wire, how in the environmental impact assessment, they proposed barbed wiring.
I managed to hang on. I'm there, yeah.
Okay, sorry, Pankaj.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, just that the use of barbed wire in this scientific document, which is, it's supposed to be, obviously an environmental impact assessment is supposed to be carried out by trained scientists, in which they propose these types of tactics. So this is you know, the same you know, fencing and isolation that we see. And of course, in Palestine as well, I mean, the largest open air, you know, kind of fenced in area that's being completely surveilled, that is obviously, as we see unfolding in Gaza now, and in the national parks that Ghada has mentioned, are other forms of this kind of enclosure. And one aspect of this is partly that, and like going from the example from Nicobar, from the compensation that they're planning in the Aravali Park, is that these areas that were home to people are now to become enclosed. So part of this sort of fencing off is also to privatize and close off spaces that would have otherwise have been, you know, places where people live, and now they're being, you know, they get enclosed. So that aspect is another component. I was also gonna, yeah, go ahead. We have a question from. I was just gonna say one thing, that the idea of sustainability, we often hear sustainability being used in all of these examples. You know, a lot of these examples, you know, this is green, this is environmental. I really take the point that you mentioned, Nicolas, about the use of the word environmentalism at all as being the first red flag or green flag that we should be aware of, but also that sustainable, like we think about the Champagne and the Nicobarese who have been there for thousands of years. We think about the relationships to the land and the territory here, that, you know, the relationship to the caribou that has been existing for thousands of years. And then one asks the question, what does sustainable really mean? What do we mean? How can even use the word sustainable in any other framing? So we have a question from the audience, so I'll pass
Just
it
as a
to
note to our audience members, if you do have a question, please raise your hand so I can see you and get this microphone to you. And to those of you online, if you have a question, please pop it into the chat and we'll be sure to read it out. So first question over here.
Hi, thank you. This was very inspiring. One of the things that came to mind when we were talking about containment, the ways that it's about, like the discourse is that it's about protection. But who is making the decisions about how that containment is happening? Whether it's actually people who are you know, the beings that are actually located in that area or that have taken care of that area or the land for, you know, millennia or whatever, or is it coming from some sort of outside entity? You know, I think that, you know, the barbed wire fence is like to somehow protect is like, I'm sure, you know, would people who have lived in a place for millennia protecting the land in a certain way through their own practices, would they set up a barbed wire fence? You know what I mean? So anyway, I was just thinking about that. The idea of like protecting a commons, I think is what's important is that the community that's actually, you know, somehow there or that has cared for it is involved in the protection. Does that involve containment? It may, because it might involve, you know, like you have land defenders that are like posted in different areas now protecting certain areas, right? But they're not setting up barbed wire fences, but it is still a form of containment to a certain extent, or not containment, but it like keeping some people out, right? Because it's always about potentially keeping some people out, right? So how do you do that?
I could just very briefly add to that you know, it is too bad that like First Nation communities in Quebec, to protect some areas of the forest now, they are going through the legal process of having the government approval for aire protégée, protected area under Quebec law. So the enclosure is the legal one. They are forced to go through that process and that mentality of a conservation area that is traced on a map in order to protect what's left, and they'll be caught in that double-sided edge, you know, where it will mean for the government, if they do grant those protected area, that everything around it is free game. So the Quebec have a few protected area project. The one that just got one approved a few years back, it was 13 years of work for the protected area of Lac Moïse, the last old-growth forest in southern Quebec. But the logging on the rest of Wendat territory is devastating. But so they have to buy into that notion. And when we're talking about like some Atikamekw and Innu land defenders who propose protected area as kind of a mitigating way of not being able to fully contain and oppose logging, but a way to save something, they are the families. It's not the nation usually. It's a family that is on that land for generations and generations. It's there, whether it's a Cree Taliman, or I don't know what they call them on the Nirowisu or the Innu. Taliman is like the kind of Cree term, but you know, it's hereditary. It's a lineage where you're steward of that part of the land. So you really know it. I was at a talk on Bill 97 in French last night, and one land defender, one lady from Wemotashi, talked about the women who bury the placenta on part of the land where their ancestors are. The connection to that part of the land is deep. The logging industry and the CAQ government in Quebec don't give a damn about the placentas that are buried in the forest in Quebec. So it speaks of what you're bringing up. Who makes the decision between the people who have those deep, meaningful connections with part of the land and how it's managed otherwise. Just wanted to add that.
We have a question in the audience as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't sure if someone else is going to answer, but I was just interested in hearing your thoughts on the relationship between greenwashing or green colonialism and the sort of branch of environmentalism that's interested in Indigenous knowledge. And especially as Starlit, I'm curious if you have encountered or had conversations with people around road ecology and what you're doing as an Indigenous person. Or Nicolas, if you've seen that in kind of national parks in Canada, especially, you know, people are aware of reconciliation and they kind of try and incorporate that into what they're doing. And yeah, I'm not sure about the context in India or Palestine at this point, but maybe start there.
Sorry, I can respond a little bit to that, I think. Sorry, you were wondering about like groups that have wanted to learn more about like what I'm doing, and like you call it like road ecology, which is cool. It's a cool term. Lately I've been getting asked to be a part of like workshops. Like recently but I would say it's mostly with Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations that are wanting to collaborate and work together on connecting with the land in different ways. So harvesting medicines together and then afterwards I show how to harvest a porcupine, or being a part of, like, I was in Montreal and we did a hide camp with the buckskin babes that are in Montreal, and people from all, like, the surrounding Indigenous communities came with their roadkill. So I harvest porcupine roadkill, but there's other people out there who harvest like raccoon roadkill and even skunk roadkill, and there's a lot of skunk medicine out there. And so I guess what I'm noticing is the Indigenous communities around me, and then in other territories, like when I was in Montreal, the Indigenous communities there, and are kind of coming together and learning off of each other how to go back to how we once were, and how we harvested all parts of the animals. We were making leather out of salmon skin, necklaces out of fish bones, harvesting and stretching and smoking and scraping hides like deer hide and moose hide. So I don't know if that answers your question really, but I would say in my experience in the past, I'd say, a couple of years, there's been more and more Indigenous groups that are trying to find ways to collaborate and come together and share knowledge with each other, land knowledge, and then like trying to, get some of that out in digital spaces a little bit as well. And I will say also, I find the arts community is really embracing and opening themselves up to this type of, or this form of like artwork, I guess. So yeah, that's it. I'm not sure if I answered your question though, but.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or thoughts, reflections? And maybe this is something that, you kind of have to sit with for a little while and let it stew, because there's a lot of information, and just this is like, it's a lot of things to think about and reflect on about what environmentalism is doing, really, and what, and what it could be differently, let's say, if we can. As we heard from Starlit, is really powerful. And yeah, also just thinking, just to maybe transition to this last little phase that we have, and feel free to mingle, there's coffee in the back. But to think about like and we actually have an image, I just remembered we have this image that we wanted to share just about thinking about like a greenwashed slogan, that of how you could look at it and like rephrase it. This is a thing that I saw during the summer this year when I was walking around the University of Toronto campus, and there was these big fences everywhere and these banners that said, and I think there's another image as well, that the University of Toronto is the world's most sustainable university. We weave sustainability into everything we do, and our initiatives include you. So yeah, with the no trespassing sign on the fence as well. So it's the question is, obviously that sustainability does not include, the people that the University of Toronto is willingly is supporting through their ongoing support of an ongoing genocide. So it's like direct, it's sustainability for certain people and funding direct murder of others. So let's not beat around the bush about that. So there's a lot of things that you can read, and we can like think about, knowing the information we have, how can we rebrand them? How can we kind of be creative with these sorts of adverts and things that we see? And Adbusters has been doing this for a long time, but I think we need to be more creative in a way to not allow these messages to have any effect, to let them fall flat before they even start. So that's the idea behind counterbranding, and something to definitely think about. So I want to thank everyone for being here, for Pankaj for being still there. I'm assuming you're still there. It's quite late, so it's huge. We're really grateful that you could be, that you're here, that you're able to present, to Ghada as well, and to Starlit and to Nicolas. Huge thanks. Thank you all as well for attending, and we will be in touch. And I'll pass it to Casey.
Thank you all so much. So we know our time is up, but if you do feel like being creative and responding via art making to what you have seen so far, there are some supplies just on the other side of the screen, and we welcome you to make things if you want. No pressure. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. Thank you to everyone, especially, I have to say, Starlit and Mi'kma'ki, my treasured friend. It was such a joy to see you in this space. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks, everyone, for coming in. Just going to let you know, we're going to close up the Zoom and the live stream now, but this remains available on our YouTube channel. You can revisit it. You can share it. You also just stick around. All right. Thanks.